The sun blazed mercilessly over the rocky plains of Hattin on that fateful day in July 1187, as two of history's most formidable armies clashed in a battle that would echo through the centuries. On one side, the Crusader forces, confident in their heavy armor and towering castles. On the other, the cunning strategist Saladin, a man whose name would become synonymous with both military genius and chivalry. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in strategy, a moment where the fate of empires hung in the balance. Saladin's victory at Hattin didn't just shatter the Crusader army, it reshaped the map of the medieval world and cemented his place as one of history's most fascinating figures. But who was this man behind the legend? A unifier of warring factions, a warrior who inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure, yet a leader whose mercy toward his enemies defied the brutality of his time. Saladin's story is more than a tale of conquest, it's a mosaic of contradictions, a life wrapped in reverence and riddled with mysteries that historians still debate today. How did a young man from Tikrit rise to command an empire stretching from Egypt to Syria? Why did his enemies, the very knights who fought against him, come to admire him as a paragon of honor? And what secrets lie buried beneath the layers of myth that have grown around his name? The answers aren't just locked in dusty chronicles, they're woven into the fabric of cultures, faiths, and even modern politics. From the halls of Damascus to the walls of Jerusalem, Saladin's legacy is a living thing, as contested and compelling now as it was 8 centuries ago. This is a journey into the heart of that legacy, a voyage through battlefields and palace intrigues, through alliances forged and betrayals suffered. We'll uncover the untold stories, the controversies that historians whisper about, and the moments that defined not just a man but an era. Was Saladin the noble hero of Islamic unity, or a shrewd politician who knew how to wield both sword and symbol? How did his triumphs and failures shape the world we live in today? Strap in, because we're about to peel back the layers of time to reveal the truth behind the legend. By the end, you won't just know Saladin's story, you'll feel it in the heat of the desert winds and the weight of the decisions that changed history. Born into a world of shifting alliances and simmering conflicts, young Saladin, or Yusuf ibn Ayyub, as he was first known, entered life in the rugged fortress town of Tikrit in 1138. His Kurdish family, the Ayyubids, were warriors by trade, serving as loyal commanders under the powerful Zengid dynasty. But his early years were far from the glittering courts of future conquest. Tikrit was a harsh place, a frontier town perched between empires where survival demanded both steel and cunning. The political landscape of the time was a chessboard of clashing powers: Fatimid Caliphs in Egypt, Seljuk sultans in Persia, and Crusader kingdoms clinging to the Levant coast. For a boy growing up in this volatile world, every lesson in swordplay came with a lesson in strategy, every clan rivalry a glimpse into the fragile nature of power. Saladin's father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, wasn't just a soldier, he was a survivor, a man who'd navigated the treacherous currents of medieval politics. When the family was exiled from Tikrit over a dispute involving the death of a rival, they found refuge in Mosul, then Aleppo, cities pulsing with the energy of war and scholarship. It was here, in the shadow of minarets and military camps, that Saladin absorbed the dual legacy of his heritage: the warrior's discipline of his Kurdish roots and the refined statecraft of the Arab world. Unlike the European knights who saw battle as a path to glory, young Saladin learned that true power lay in patience, in knowing when to strike and when to weave alliances. Yet what set him apart wasn't just his upbringing, it was the extraordinary moment history handed him. The Crusader states, though formidable, were brittle, their knights divided by internal squabbles. The Muslim world, meanwhile, was a patchwork of rival emirs and caliphs, ripe for unification. Saladin's genius lay in recognizing this fragility and turning it to his advantage. By his 20s, he'd risen through the ranks of the Zengid army, not just as a skilled commander, but as a diplomat who could speak the language of both desert tribes and urban scholars. His Kurdish identity, often sidelined in the Arab-dominated courts, became an unexpected strength, an outsider's perspective that let him see beyond old feuds. The siege of Alexandria in 1167 would be his proving ground. Tasked with defending the city against Crusader forces, Saladin didn't just repel invaders. He outthought them, using supply lines and psychological warfare as deftly as his cavalry. It was a glimpse of the tactician who would later reclaim Jerusalem, a man who understood that wars weren't won by strength alone, but by the hearts and minds of those caught in between. Even then, whispers followed him, stories of a leader who treated defeated enemies with respect, who spared civilians when others demanded blood. These weren't just acts of mercy, they were calculations, the early strokes of a man painting his legend across the canvas of history. Behind the future sultan's rise, though, lay a question few chroniclers asked: how much of his path was destiny and how much was sheer adaptability? The boy from Tikrit hadn't been born to a throne. He'd seized opportunity after opportunity, bending circumstance to his will. In a world where dynasties rose and fell like desert storms, Saladin's greatest weapon may have been his ability to reinvent himself, to turn exile into advantage and rivals into allies. By the time he stood before the gates of Cairo in 1169, poised to overthrow the Fatimid Caliphate, the once obscure Kurdish officer had become something far more dangerous, a man who could unite the fractured Muslim world under a single banner and change the course of history. The path to greatness rarely begins with a crown. For Saladin, it started in the shadow of another ruler, Nur ad-Din Zengi, the fierce and pious warrior king who dreamed of uniting the Muslim world against the Crusaders. When young Saladin arrived at Nur ad-Din's court, he was just another Kurdish officer, one face among many in an army of ambitious men, but something about him caught the ruler's eye. Maybe it was his quiet intensity or the way he absorbed every lesson in war and governance like a sponge. Under Nur ad-Din's wing, Saladin didn't just learn to fight, he learned to lead. Nur ad-Din's empire was a forge, and Saladin was tempered in its flames. The Zengid ruler wasn't just a conqueror, he was a reformer, a man who blended martial prowess with deep religious devotion. His campaigns against the Crusaders weren't mere raids, they were calculated strikes meant to weaken enemy morale. And Saladin was there for it all, from the sieges of Antioch to the skirmishes along the Jordan River. He saw firsthand how Nur ad-Din used propaganda, painting himself as the defender of Islam to rally fractious emirs. He watched how battles were won not just with swords, but with supply lines, spies, and timely alliances. These weren't just tactics, they were the building blocks of an empire. But mentorship under Nur ad-Din wasn't only about warfare. The court at Aleppo and Damascus was a school of statecraft where Saladin absorbed the delicate art of ruling a fractured realm. Nur ad-Din understood that loyalty couldn't be taken for granted, it had to be earned. He built hospitals, funded scholars, and presented himself as a just ruler. Saladin took these lessons to heart. By the time he was given his first independent command, a risky expedition to quell a rebellion in Egypt, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a leader who knew how to balance the sword and the scroll, yet their relationship wasn't without tension. Nur ad-Din was a man of rigid orthodoxy, while Saladin had a knack for pragmatism. When Saladin overthrew the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, he didn't destroy its institutions, he repurposed them, keeping the bureaucracy intact. Nur ad-Din, wary of his protege's growing power, began to see him as a potential rival. The stage was set for a silent struggle between teacher and student, a dance of loyalty and ambition. When Nur ad-Din died suddenly in 1174, the Muslim world held its breath. Would Saladin honor his mentor's legacy or carve his own path? The answer, as history would show, was both. He took Nur ad-Din's dream of unity and made it a reality, but on his own terms. Looking back, it's clear that without Nur ad-Din, there might never have been a Saladin as we know him. The young officer who entered his service was raw talent. The man who emerged was a leader forged in war and wisdom. Their story is more than succession, it's a testament to how great leaders are made, not born. And in the dust of their campaigns, the seeds of a legend were sown. Egypt was a prize worth any risk. By the late 1160s, the Fatimid Caliphate, once a shining beacon of Shia Islam, had crumbled into decadence and disarray. Its palaces in Cairo overflowed with gold, but its armies faltered, its governors squabbled, and its people starved. For Saladin, then a rising star in Nur ad-Din's service, the chaos presented an opportunity draped in danger. Sent to Egypt under the pretense of aiding the Fatimids against Crusader threats, he arrived in 1167 not as a savior, but as a wolf in sheep's clothing. His mission was clear: undermine the Fatimids from within and plant the Zengid banner over the Nile. What followed wasn't just a conquest, it was a masterclass in political chess. Saladin's first moves were deceptively subtle. Instead of storming palaces, he studied them. The Fatimid court was a snake pit of rival viziers, each vying for power, while the young caliph, Al-Adid, reigned as little more than a figurehead. Saladin played these factions against one another, offering support to weakening viziers only to withdraw it at critical moments. When the Crusader king Amalric of Jerusalem besieged Cairo, Saladin didn't just defend the city. He used the crisis to consolidate control, positioning himself as Egypt's indispensable protector. By the time Nur ad-Din's reinforcements arrived, Saladin had already been appointed vizier, the de facto ruler behind the crumbling Fatimid throne, but titles meant little without loyalty. The real challenge came in transforming Egypt's religious landscape. For 2 centuries, the Fatimids had championed Shia Islam, their grand mosques and madrasas standing as monuments to a rival interpretation of the faith. Overnight, Saladin began dismantling this legacy. He replaced Shia preachers with Sunni scholars, redirected funds from Fatimid institutions to those loyal to his cause, and quietly marginalized the old elite. Yet his genius lay in restraint. He never ordered mass persecutions or public purges. Instead, he let time erode the Fatimid legacy, ensuring stability even as he rewrote Egypt's spiritual identity. The final act came in 1171 when Caliph Al-Adid lay dying. In his last moments, the young ruler supposedly embraced Sunni Islam, a conversion historians still debate was genuine or coerced. With no heir, the Fatimid dynasty vanished overnight. Saladin, now Egypt's unchallenged master, didn't just inherit a kingdom. He inherited its vast treasury, its thriving ports, and an army that could match any in the region. But his greatest triumph was invisible: the goodwill of a population weary of chaos. Where previous conquerors had ruled through fear, Saladin offered order. He lowered taxes for the poor, fortified Cairo's walls, and presented himself not as a foreign usurper, but as Egypt's rightful steward. This wasn't merely a change of rulers. It was a tectonic shift in the medieval world's balance of power. With Egypt under his belt, Saladin controlled the richest lands in the Muslim East, from the cotton fields of the Delta to the trade routes of the Red Sea. More crucially, he now stood at the crossroads of faith and politics, a Sunni champion in a region long dominated by Shia dynasties. The boy from Tikrit had become a kingmaker, and his gaze was already turning east toward Damascus and beyond. The fall of the Fatimids wasn't an end. It was the first move in a game that would eventually reclaim Jerusalem. With Egypt firmly under his control, Saladin faced a challenge far more complex than conquest consolidation. The Muslim world remained fractured, a patchwork of emirs and warlords more interested in personal power than unified resistance against the Crusaders. His first test came from an unexpected quarter: his own kin. The Zengid dynasty, the very house that had nurtured his rise, now saw him as a threat. Nur ad-Din's son, as-Salih Ismail, was just a boy when his father died, but the generals surrounding him were seasoned warriors who distrusted Saladin's ambitions. What followed wasn't just a power struggle, it was a high-stakes game of diplomacy and deception where allegiances shifted like desert sands. Aleppo and Mosul, the twin jewels of Zengid power, became the battlegrounds for Saladin's legitimacy. The governor of Aleppo, Gumashtijan, declared himself protector of young as-Salih, branding Saladin a usurper. Meanwhile, Mosul's ruler, Saif ad-Din, mobilized armies to challenge the upstart from Egypt. But Saladin understood something his enemies did not. Victory wasn't just about armies. It was about perception. He framed his campaign not as a grab for power, but as a sacred duty to unite Islam against the Crusaders. When his forces clashed with Saif ad-Din at the Battle of Hattin in 1175, Saladin didn't just defeat him, he pardoned him, a calculated act of mercy that turned a rival into a wary ally. The real masterstroke, though, came in the shadows. Saladin cultivated relationships with the ulama, the religious scholars whose influence could sway entire cities. He funded madrasas, restored neglected mosques, and positioned himself as a defender of Sunni orthodoxy. This wasn't mere piety, it was political genius. When Aleppo finally fell to his forces in 1183, it wasn't through brute force alone. The city's elites, tired of Gumashtijan's mismanagement, quietly opened the gates. Even as Salih, the boy whose throne Saladin had supposedly usurped, was treated with respect, married to Saladin's niece and given lands to rule. Every move was designed to legitimize his rule without sparking rebellion. But not all opposition could be smoothed over with diplomacy. The assassins, the infamous Shia sect lurking in their mountain fortresses, saw Saladin as a mortal enemy. Twice they sent killers armed with poisoned daggers, forcing him to sleep in a wooden enclosure to avoid stealth attacks. Their leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, was a phantom who couldn't be bribed or bullied. In the end, Saladin did what he did best: he adapted. Rather than waste armies sieging impregnable castles, he reached an uneasy truce, allowing the assassins to remain neutral so long as they stopped targeting his men. By the late 1180s, Saladin's empire stretched from the Nile to the Tigris, a feat no Muslim ruler had achieved in centuries. But this unity was fragile, held together by his personal charisma and the shared dream of Jerusalem's liberation. The emirs who bowed to him did so out of pragmatism as much as loyalty, a truth that would shape the battles to come. What made his consolidation remarkable wasn't just the scale of his dominion, but the way he wielded it, not as a tyrant, but as a strategist who knew that true power lies in the hearts of those you rule. By 1187, the Holy Land had become a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The Crusader states, once a formidable wall against the Muslim world, were now riddled with divisions. King Guy of Lusignan, a ruler more suited to courtly intrigue than battlefield command, clung to power despite whispers of his incompetence. Meanwhile, Raynald of Chatillon, the brash lord of Kerak, had broken every truce with Saladin, raiding caravans and even threatening Mecca itself. Each provocation was a match thrown onto dry kindling. When Raynald attacked a Muslim pilgrimage caravan in blatant violation of the peace, Saladin's patience snapped. He swore an oath to kill Raynald with his own hands. The stage was set not just for battle, but for annihilation. Saladin understood his enemies better than they understood themselves. The Crusaders relied on their heavy cavalry, the famed knights whose charges could shatter lines, but they were slaves to their own tactics. They needed open fields, predictable battles, and reliable supply lines. So Saladin gave them none of it. He baited them into the one terrain where their strengths would become weaknesses, the waterless hills near Hattin. Through calculated raids and feigned retreats, he lured King Guy's army away from their coastal strongholds, cutting off their access to the Sea of Galilee's fresh water. The Crusaders, clad in suffocating chainmail under the July sun, marched straight into his trap. Negotiation had been attempted, of course. Saladin, ever the pragmatist, offered terms safe passage in exchange for surrender. But pride and poor counsel doomed the Crusaders. Against the advice of seasoned warriors like Raymond of Tripoli, King Guy ordered his forces deeper into the desert. As temperatures soared, discipline collapsed, men dropped from thirst, their tongues swelling as they crawled toward mirages. Saladin's archers lit the dry grass, choking the Crusaders with smoke while his cavalry harried their flanks. By the time they reached the horns of Hattin, a pair of barren hilltops, they were already broken not by swords but by sun and strategy. What happened next wasn't just a defeat, it was the unraveling of a century of Crusader dominance. Saladin's forces encircled the exhausted Christians, capturing the true cross, their most sacred relic. King Guy and Reynold were brought before him in chains. In a moment etched into legend, Saladin offered Guy a cup of chilled rosewater, a gesture of mercy to a fellow king. Then he turned to Reynold. True to his oath, he drew his scimitar and struck the rogue lord down himself. The message was clear. This was not mere conquest, but retribution wrapped in calculated spectacle. Hattin's brilliance lay not in the bloodshed, but in the planning. Saladin had turned the Crusaders' greatest assets, their heavy armor, their reliance on set-piece battles, into fatal liabilities. He fought the land as much as the enemy, letting the desert wage war for him. Within months, Jerusalem itself would fall, its gates opened not by siege engines, but by the shockwaves of a single masterstroke in the wilderness. The Crusader kingdoms never fully recovered. And Saladin, he didn't just win a battle, he rewrote the rules of war. The Crusader army stumbled through the dust-choked hills near Hattin like men already half dead, their tongues glued to the roofs of their mouths from 2 days without water. Saladin's scouts had sealed every spring, every muddy pool, leaving the enemy to bake under the unforgiving July sun. When the desperate Christians finally spotted the glint of Lake Tiberias in the distance, it was a cruel mirage. Saladin's cavalry blocked the path, their swords glinting as they taunted the parched knights with dripping waterskins. The true cross, carried aloft by Bishop Rufus of Acre, became a magnet for Muslim arrows, its golden casing catching fire as flaming shafts rained down. With each passing hour, the greatest army the Crusader states had ever assembled unraveled further, knights dismounting to butcher their own horses for blood to drink, infantry collapsing face first into the thorny brush. Saladin's tactics were psychological as much as military. His men lit wildfires across the dry grasslands, forcing the Crusaders to choose between choking smoke or exposed hills where Kurdish archers picked them off. When the desperate Christian infantry broke ranks to charge the Muslim lines, they found no solid enemy to engage, only swirling horsemen who melted away before counterattacking from new angles. The Crusaders' famed heavy cavalry, their greatest strength, became their doom. Trapped on the horns of Hattin, 2 barren hilltops stripped of shade, their plate armor turned into ovens, cooking men alive as temperatures soared. King Guy's pavilion, erected in a last bid to project authority, became a symbol of futility when Saladin's camels dragged it away as war spoils. The climax came at dusk on July 4th. With the Crusaders' ranks shattered, Saladin's elite guard descended on the surviving nobles. King Guy, his lips cracked with thirst, was brought before the Sultan trembling, expecting the same fate as the prisoners he'd executed years prior. Instead, Saladin offered him a silver goblet of chilled julep, a gesture that echoed through history. "A king does not kill a king," he murmured, though the mercy was strategic. Guy's incompetence made him more valuable alive. Then came Reynold of Chatillon. The man who had dared threaten Mecca met a different end. Saladin reminded him of his broken oaths before personally wielding the executioner's blade, a moment so jarring that Guy, still clutching his cup, fainted at the spray of blood. But the true spiritual devastation came with the fate of the true cross. When the relic was hauled before Saladin's tent, its splintered wood smeared with ash, Muslim soldiers fell to their knees, not in reverence but triumph. For generations, this symbol had led Christian chargers into battle, its loss striking deeper than any military defeat. Saladin ordered it paraded through Damascus upside down, dragging in the dirt behind a mule. Yet even here, his calculation shone through. He refused to destroy it, preserving it as both trophy and bargaining chip. The message was unmistakable. The tide of history had turned, and the architect of this reversal was a leader who understood that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the theater of symbols and the hearts of those who bear witness. Jerusalem waited in terrified silence as Saladin's army encircled its ancient walls in September 1187. The city's fate seemed sealed. Medieval warfare had a simple, brutal calculus. Cities that resisted were sacked, their inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The Crusaders themselves had set the precedent when they stormed Jerusalem in 1099, leaving its streets ankle-deep in blood. Yet what unfolded over the next 2 weeks defied every expectation. Saladin, the man who had shattered the Crusader army at Hattin, now wielded restraint like a weapon. Instead of battering the gates, he opened negotiations, offering terms so lenient they stunned both allies and enemies. For every gold piece, a life could be spared. Women, children, and the elderly could buy their freedom. Only the defeated knights would face ransom. But even then, Saladin quietly paid for thousands he'd sworn to destroy. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Where the First Crusade had turned Jerusalem's mosques into stables and its people into corpses, Saladin entered the city on a promise: no pillaging, no massacre, no revenge. His troops were kept leashed, their swords sheathed as Christian processions filed past Muslim guards to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When Balian of Ayyubid, the city's desperate defender, threatened to destroy every holy site rather than surrender, Saladin didn't call his bluff. He expanded the terms, adding churches and monasteries to the list of protected places. Even the Orthodox Christians, long oppressed by their Latin rulers, found an unlikely ally in the Sultan, who restored their rights while their former masters fled. But this mercy wasn't just kindness, it was strategy distilled to its purest form. Saladin knew Jerusalem wasn't just stone and mortar, it was a symbol, a prize that would echo across continents. By sparing its people, he robbed the West of its rallying cry. European chronicles that had painted Muslims as monsters now struggled to reconcile their prejudice with reports of a conqueror who gifted freed prisoners with supplies for their journey. When Queen Sibylla, King Guy's wife, begged for her captured ladies in waiting to be released, Saladin didn't demand gold. He set them free as a tribute to her dignity. These gestures weren't random, they were calculated strokes in a propaganda war far more enduring than any siege. Yet the myths that grew around this moment reveal as much about history's hunger for heroes as they do about the man himself. Later poets would spin tales of Saladin personally escorting elderly Christians to safety or offering his horse to a wounded enemy knight, stories more allegory than fact. The truth lies somewhere between legend and ledger books. Ransom records show many couldn't pay and were enslaved regardless. The poor who stayed behind faced conversion or servitude. But even these harsh realities were tempered by medieval standards. Compare it to the slaughter of Muslims and Jews centuries earlier, and Saladin's capture of Jerusalem stands as a masterclass in controlled victory, a reminder that the greatest conquerors know when to sheath their swords and let mercy speak louder than bloodshed. In the end, Saladin's triumph wasn't just about retaking a city, it was about rewriting the rules of conquest. When he ordered the golden cross atop the dome of the rock taken down, he didn't destroy it. He had it returned to the Christians intact. When his generals demanded the right to loot, he overruled them, preserving Jerusalem's sanctity for all faiths. This wasn't weakness, it was wisdom carved from decades of war. He understood that how you win determines how long victory lasts, and as the call to prayer echoed once more through Jerusalem's streets, mingling with church bells and whispered hymns, it was clear this wasn't just the fall of a Crusader kingdom. It was the birth of a legend that would outlive empires. The Third Crusade brought together two of history's most legendary warriors, Saladin, the aging but cunning sultan of a united Muslim empire, and Richard the Lionheart, the fiery young king of England who arrived in the Holy Land like a storm from the west. Their clash wasn't just a battle of armies, it was a collision of philosophies, a duel between two men who embodied completely different visions of warfare and honor. Where Saladin preferred patience and psychological maneuvering, Richard charged headlong into battle, his personal bravery inspiring both awe and recklessness. The Siege of Acre, their first major confrontation, revealed this contrast in stark relief. For nearly 2 grueling years, Acre had been the thorn in Saladin's side, a coastal stronghold where Crusader forces, reinforced by European arrivals, clung to the last remnants of their kingdom. Saladin's strategy had been classic siege warfare: encircle, starve, and wait. He blockaded the city by land while his fleet patrolled the waters, content to let hunger do his work. But Richard changed the equation. Landing with fresh troops and massive siege engines in 1191, he turned the confrontation into a brutal contest of wills. His engineers built towering catapults that hurled stones day and night, while miners tunneled beneath Acre's walls. Saladin, watching from the hills, launched diversionary attacks to relieve pressure on the city, but Richard refused to take the bait. The Lionheart didn't just want victory, he wanted spectacle, ordering attacks even during truces to prove his relentlessness. And yet, for all their differences, the two leaders developed a grudging respect. When Richard fell ill with fever during the siege, Saladin sent him fresh fruit and snow from Mount Hermon to ease his suffering, a gesture that shocked contemporaries. They exchanged messengers debating the merits of their faiths, with Richard even jesting that if Jerusalem couldn't be his, he hoped Saladin would keep it rather than see it go to another Christian prince. Beneath the bloodshed, there was recognition. Each saw in the other a worthy adversary, a mirror reflecting their own strengths and flaws. The stalemate that followed Acre's fall would define the rest of their conflict. Richard's victory had come at a horrific cost: his execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners after Saladin delayed paying their ransom stained his reputation. But what followed was a chess game across Palestine. Richard marched south toward Jerusalem, winning brilliant victories at Arsuf and Jaffa through disciplined cavalry charges. Yet every time he pushed inland, Saladin's scorched earth tactics left the Crusaders starving in the ruins of abandoned towns. The Sultan knew Richard's weakness, the English king's impatience for a decisive battle, and refused to give it to him. Instead, he harried supply lines, poisoned wells, and vanished into the hills like a phantom. By 1192, the truth was undeniable: neither man could deliver a knockout blow. Richard, isolated politically by news of plots back in England, needed a face-saving exit. Saladin, his army exhausted and his emirs grumbling about endless war, couldn't risk another Hattin-style gamble. Their final agreement was a masterpiece of pragmatic theater, a truce that let Christian pilgrims enter Jerusalem while leaving the city under Muslim control. Richard rode to the holy city's gates but refused to enter, knowing that to see what he couldn't conquer would break his spirit. Saladin, ever the strategist, allowed the gesture, understanding that symbols sometimes matter more than swords. When Richard sailed for Europe, their rivalry remained unresolved by victory or defeat. But in their 3-year duel, they had redefined what it meant to be a warrior king. Richard's raw courage and Saladin's calculating restraint became the twin poles of medieval leadership. Their story wasn't just about clashing armies, it was about the paradox of greatness, how two men so different could each be right in their own way. And though they never met face to face, their legends would forever be intertwined, like the dust and blood of the land they fought so fiercely to claim. By 1193, the conqueror who had outmaneuvered kings and reclaimed Jerusalem was a shadow of himself. Saladin's once boundless energy faltered, his keen strategic mind clouded by weeks of unshakable fever. Court physicians whispered behind their sleeves as the Sultan's hands trembled, lifting a wine cup not from fear, but from a weakness no amount of willpower could disguise. The man who had spent 30 years in the saddle now struggled to mount his horse without assistance. What sinister force could bring low a warrior who'd survived 100 battles? The answers lie tangled in medieval medical ignorance, political intrigue, and the relentless toll of a life lived at war's razor edge. Contemporary accounts describe symptoms that still puzzle historians today: violent headaches, jaundiced skin, and a fever that spiked like a desert mirage, burning one day, gone the next. Poisoning rumors swirled immediately. The assassins, those shadowy daggers in the dark, were prime suspects had they finally succeeded where armies failed. Yet Saladin himself dismissed the theory, and modern toxicology leans against it. Most medieval poisons acted swiftly, not in this drawn-out torment. Others whispered of betrayal closer to home. His nephew Taqi al-Din had already clashed with him over succession, while rival emirs chafed under his rule. But if foul play existed, no chronicler dared name the culprit outright. Typhoid fever emerges as a likelier culprit. The disease stalked medieval camps like a ghost, spread by contaminated food and water. Saladin's own campaigns had left trails of overflowing latrines and tainted wells, a grim irony that the Sultan who mastered terrain might have been felled by it. Yet even this explanation feels incomplete. His symptoms lingered far longer than typical typhoid cases, suggesting something more complex. Malaria, endemic to the Nile Delta where he'd spent years, could explain the recurring fevers. Or perhaps cirrhosis, a warrior's liver ravaged by decades of celebratory feasts and stress-soaked nights. The truth may lie not in a single illness, but in the cumulative weight of a life spent waging war. Saladin had governed an empire without pause since his 30s, sleeping in armor more often than silks. Chronic stress weakens the body's defenses, leaving even the strongest vulnerable. His final campaign against Richard had pushed him to exhaustion, riding through dust storms with his armor strapped over robes soaked in sweat and old wounds. Modern medicine recognizes how prolonged adrenal fatigue can unravel the heartiest constitutions. Maybe history's greatest unifier was simply spent, his body refusing the burdens his mind willed it to bear. In his last days, Saladin turned away physicians and their leeches, choosing instead to distribute his wealth to the poor. It was a final act of control from a man who'd commanded empires. When death came on March 4, 1193, it found him not on a battlefield but in the Damascus palace he'd rarely used, a conqueror who'd given everything, including his health, for a vision of unity that would flicker and fade with his passing. The real mystery isn't what killed Saladin, but how he endured so long. The chamber where Saladin took his final breath held none of the opulence one might expect for a man who'd reshaped empires. Wrapped in a simple woolen shroud, the conqueror of Jerusalem died as he'd lived without pretense in a modest room of his Damascus citadel. When attendants inventoried his possessions, they found barely enough gold to cover funeral expenses. No hoarded treasures, no vaults spilling with jewels, just a few personal items and a handful of coins. The stunned silence that followed this discovery spoke volumes. Here was a ruler who'd commanded lands from Egypt to Syria, yet whose death revealed a truth more startling than any battlefield victory. Power for Saladin had never been about wealth. His burial mirrored this austerity. Unlike the gilded mausoleums of other sultans, Saladin's grave was a humble affair. A plain stone marker in the courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque, open to the sky and the footsteps of passing worshippers. Later rulers would embellish it, but in those first days it stood as a quiet rebuke to the extravagance of kings. What made this simplicity so extraordinary wasn't just the contrast with his achievements, but the deliberate choice behind it. Saladin had spent decades funneling state funds into armies and public works, personally financing ransoms for prisoners and scholarships for students. The empty treasury wasn't neglect, it was policy, a living testament to his belief that a leader's worth was measured in deeds, not dinars. The reaction across the Muslim world bordered on disbelief. Poets who'd sung of his conquests now wrote elegies to his poverty, marveling that the man who could have bathed in gold chose instead to die indebted. Even his rivals found themselves disarmed. Richard the Lionheart, upon hearing of Saladin's death, reportedly sent condolences and a new silk shroud to replace the coarse one used in burial. It was a gesture that cut to the heart of Saladin's legacy. Here was an adversary so extraordinary that even enemies felt compelled to honor him. Yet this austerity wasn't mere humility, it was political theater of the highest order. In an age where rulers cemented legitimacy through displays of wealth, Saladin's rejection of ornament became its own kind of power. By embracing poverty, he cast himself as the ideal Islamic ruler, the warrior saint who cared nothing for worldly riches. The message resonated deeply in a culture that venerated the Prophet Muhammad's own simple lifestyle. Every bare wall in his palace, every unpaid debt in his ledger became another thread in the legend, reinforcing the image of a man who fought for faith, not fortune. Centuries later, that symbolism still lingers. Visitors to his Damascus tomb often pause, expecting grandeur befitting the Lion of Islam, only to find unadorned stone. The surprise mirrors what his contemporaries must have felt, that rare awe reserved for those who master the ultimate trick of leadership, proving that true greatness needs no gilding. In the end, Saladin's grave may be his most enduring victory, a monument not to what he took, but to what he chose to leave behind. Saladin's greatest fear wasn't defeat on the battlefield, it was the unraveling of everything he'd built by the hands of his own blood. The empire he'd stitched together through decades of war and diplomacy didn't crumble under Crusader swords. It fractured in the petty squabbles of his sons and nephews. Before his body had even grown cold in Damascus, the Ayyubid princes turned on each other like starving wolves over a carcass. His eldest son, Al-Afdal, inherited Damascus but lacked his father's iron grip, watching helplessly as his uncles carved up the realm. In Egypt, Saladin's brother Al-Adil, the man who'd once been his most trusted general, seized power with ruthless efficiency, sidelining Al-Afdal and plunging the family into civil war. The irony was bitter. Saladin had spent his life uniting Muslims against a common enemy, only for his heirs to prioritize personal ambition over the empire's survival. Al-Afdal, ousted from Damascus by his own uncle, begged for help from the Crusaders he was supposed to fight. In Aleppo, another son, Az-Zahir, clung to power by playing his relatives against each other, turning the city into a fortress of paranoia. The once cohesive Ayyubid state became a patchwork of rival fiefdoms, each ruler minting his own coins and raising his own armies while the Mongols loomed on the horizon. Yet the tragedy wasn't just in the infighting, it was in the wasted potential. Saladin's successors inherited not just land, but the loyalty of warriors who'd bled for their father's vision. Had they stood united, they might have secured Jerusalem for another century. Instead, they wasted their strength in sieges against each other while Crusader remnants regrouped. Even Al-Adil, the shrewdest of them all, couldn't replicate his brother's charisma. He ruled through manipulation rather than inspiration, buying off rivals with gold instead of binding them with shared purpose. By the mid-13th century, the Ayyubid dynasty was a hollow shell. Saladin's grandchildren squabbled over shrinking territories as new threats emerged, not just the Crusaders, but the rising Mamluks, the slave soldiers who'd once been their enforcers. In 1250, the Mamluks would overthrow the last Ayyubid ruler in Egypt, erasing Saladin's bloodline from power. The family's final descendants faded into obscurity, their names remembered only in dusty genealogies. What makes their fall so haunting isn't its inevitability, but its avoidability. The Ayyubids didn't lack resources or talent, they lacked the one thing Saladin had in abundance: the understanding that true power lies in unity. His sons fought over the throne but forgot the lesson written in their father's every victory, that empires built by one man's will can only endure if those who follow put something greater than themselves first. The Crusaders who had crossed seas to kill Muslims returned home with stories that baffled their chroniclers' tales of an enemy who showed more chivalry than Christian kings. In the halls of Europe, where Saracens were usually painted as devil-worshipping savages, Saladin became an anomaly, a pagan worthy of respect. Troubadours sang of his generosity to captured knights, monks grudgingly recorded his mercy toward Jerusalem's civilians and even the Templars. His sworn foes whispered about the Sultan who kept his word when Frankish lords broke theirs. This contradiction reveals a fascinating truth. Medieval Europe was wrestling with cognitive dissonance. How could their greatest enemy also be the most honorable man they'd ever faced? The answer lies in the ink-stained pages of manuscripts that transformed Saladin from a historical figure into something far more dangerous to the Crusader worldview, a moral mirror. Take the romances of the 13th century, where Saladin starts appearing as a recurring character, but not as a villain. In stories like the Romance of Saladin, he's recast as a noble adversary, a foil to highlight the corruption of European rulers. One tale describes him disguising himself as a pilgrim to safely tour Crusader lands, marveling at their churches while criticizing their greed. Another depicts him sparing a young knight because the boy's bravery reminds him of his own youth. These weren't historical accounts, they were subversive fantasies using the Muslim leader to critique Christian society's failings, even more startling. Some versions gave him a secret backstory claiming he'd been baptized or descended from a hidden line of Christian royalty. The message was clear: if such a man couldn't be converted, perhaps the problem wasn't his faith but theirs. Then there's Dante. In the Divine Comedy, written a century after Saladin's death, the poet performs a theological somersault. Amidst the swirling mists of limbo, the place where virtuous pagans dwell without torment, stands Saladin, solitary and majestic. He's placed alongside Hector, Aeneas, and Aristotle, souls Dante admired but couldn't admit to heaven. For a medieval Christian to grant a Muslim such prestige was unprecedented. Limbo wasn't salvation, but it was an absolution of sorts, a recognition that valor and virtue existed beyond the boundaries of the cross. Dante's choice speaks volumes. Even in a work meant to affirm Catholic doctrine, he couldn't bring himself to consign Saladin to hell. The irony is delicious. While Muslim chroniclers were meticulously recording Saladin's every administrative decree, European artists were turning him into legend, a symbol of what knighthood should be. His presence in their stories didn't soften their hatred of Islam. If anything, it sharpened their critiques of Christendom's hypocrisies. When Saladin gave King Guy water at Hattin while Reynold bled out, he didn't just win a battle, he exposed the hollowness of Crusader claims to moral superiority. Centuries later, Voltaire would sum it up neatly. The Christians who cursed Saladin's victories secretly admired the man who practiced the charity their own gospels preached. Perhaps that's the ultimate testament to his legacy. To be hated by your enemies is expected. To haunt their conscience long after your death, that's power. While medieval Europe struggled to reconcile Saladin's virtues with their prejudice, the Islamic world crafted its own mythos around the Sultan, one that would evolve dramatically over centuries. Early Arab chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir and Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani wrote not just as historians but as court propagandists, shaping Saladin into the Sunni champion who purified Jerusalem from Crusader defilement. Their accounts brim with telling omissions. The Kurdish general's rise through Zengid patronage gets downplayed, while his dismantling of the Shia Fatimids gets framed as divine mandate. This wasn't mere record-keeping, it was political alchemy, transforming a shrewd warlord into the embodiment of Islamic unity. Yet the real metamorphosis came in the 19th century, when European colonialism reignited the Crusade's symbolic power. Arab intellectuals digging through archives found in Saladin a potent weapon against imperial narratives. Lebanese writer Jerzy Zaidan's serialized novels cast him as a pan-Arab hero, deliberately fudging his Kurdish roots to fit nationalist agendas. The message was electric. If a sultan 8 centuries past could expel Western invaders, so could modern resistance movements. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's firebrand president, weaponized this imagery during the Suez Crisis, commissioning murals of Saladin's triumphs beside his own nationalization of the canal. Even his enemies played along. Israeli strategists coined the term Saladin Doctrine for Arab encirclement tactics in the Six-Day War, unwittingly cementing his legend in military lexicons. Modern pop culture twists the thread further. Syrian TV's blockbuster series Saladin the Victorious portrays him as a proto-socialist liberator, while Erdogan's Turkey reclaims him as proof of Turkic leadership over the Muslim world. Never mind that Saladin barely spoke Turkish. The Sultan's citadels, once military strongholds, now host UNESCO-funded restoration projects that carefully airbrush the complexities of his reign. What emerges isn't history, but a hall of mirrors where every faction sees its reflection. The Crusaders' noble adversary, the Kurdish upstart, the Sunni unifier, all these Saladins coexist, reshaped by each generation's anxieties and ambitions. Perhaps the most revealing distortion lies in the gaps. Few modern depictions dwell on Saladin's pragmatic alliances with Christian powers, or his brutal suppression of Muslim rivals like the Assassins. The man who spent more years fighting fellow Muslims than Crusaders gets recast as the eternal defender against Western aggression. This selective memory speaks volumes about how legends metabolize truth, not as fact but as fuel for contemporary struggles. The real Saladin might not recognize himself in these reflections, but their very contradictions prove his enduring power, a symbol malleable enough to unite, divide, and inspire long after his bones turn to dust. Among the dusty scrolls of medieval chroniclers lies a tantalizing mystery: what happened to the staggering wealth Saladin claimed after his victories? When Jerusalem's gates swung open in 1187, the Crusader treasury brimmed with gold, holy relics, and jewels accumulated over nearly a century of Christian rule. Contemporary accounts describe wagons groaning under the weight of plunder as it trundled toward Damascus. Yet within decades, whispers began: had the Sultan's fabled riches vanished into thin air? One enduring legend points to the Fatimid palaces of Cairo. Before Saladin dismantled their regime, the Shia caliphs had amassed treasures that made European kings seem paupers. Gem-encrusted thrones, solid gold zodiac mosaics, even a hall where mechanical statues poured wine for guests. Though Saladin famously distributed much of his wealth to soldiers and the poor, rumors persist that his most precious prizes were hidden, not spent. 12th century geographer Al-Idrisi claimed a secret network of cisterns beneath Cairo held the Sultan's reserve, while later Mamluk historians wrote of laborers vanishing after sealing underground chambers. Modern archaeologists have indeed found submerged tunnels near Saladin's citadel, their walls etched with Ayyubid symbols but no gold. Then there's the enigma of Jerusalem's missing artifacts. While Saladin returned the true cross to Richard as a bargaining chip, other relics disappeared entirely. The crown jewels of the Crusader kingdom, including rubies said to be carved from Herod's temple walls, never resurfaced in Muslim inventories. A curious passage in an Armenian chronicle suggests Saladin gifted them to Kurdish tribal leaders as insurance against future rebellions, burying them near Tikrit, his birthplace. Intriguingly, Saddam Hussein reportedly funded excavations there in the 1990s, though nothing was found. The most provocative theory comes from Venetian merchant logs. After the Sultan's death, traders recorded whispers of a desert convoy seen racing toward the Red Sea coast. Some speculate this was Saladin's inner circle safeguarding a final horde, perhaps in the mountains of Yemen where his descendants fled during Mongol invasions. Bedouin oral traditions speak of a cave of the eagle, its entrance marked with a sword symbol, but no explorer has ever confirmed its existence. What makes these stories fascinating isn't just their romance, it's the psychological puzzle they present. A ruler who died penniless couldn't have left vaults of jewels unless the tales serve a deeper purpose. Perhaps they're metaphors for Saladin's greatest treasure, not gold, but the unshakable loyalty he inspired. Or maybe, just maybe, some dusty cavern still cradles remnants of his legacy, waiting for a chance discovery to rewrite history. Either way, the hunt itself reveals more than any chest of coins ever could: our endless fascination with a man who turned conquest into legend. Saladin's battlefield victories didn't just happen under the glare of the desert sun. They were forged in shadow, through a web of spies so vast and efficient they'd make modern intelligence agencies take notes. While Crusader knights boasted about chivalric codes and open combat, Saladin mastered a different art: the silent war of information. His operatives weren't just scouts, they were merchants peddling silks in Tripoli's markets, monks copying manuscripts in Antioch's monasteries, even disgraced knights defecting to Crusader camps with poisoned whispers. One of his most audacious agents, a Syrian Christian named Isa al-Aswad, spent years posing as a physician in Jerusalem's royal court, leaking troop movements coded into medical prescriptions. Pigeons became his stealthiest weapons. Saladin's courier network stretched from Cairo to Mosul, with trained birds carrying tiny scrolls in hollow leg bands, messages written in lemon juice that only appeared when heated. These feathered spies could outpace any horseman, delivering updates on enemy supply lines or shifting alliances before Crusaders even knew their plans were compromised. During the siege of Acre, it was a pigeon that warned Saladin of Richard the Lionheart's naval reinforcements, buying him critical days to reposition his forces. But the real stroke of genius, feeding the Crusaders' own carrier pigeons false intelligence, a trick that lured Guy of Lusignan into the waterless trap at Hattin. The Sultan's spies didn't just gather intel, they weaponized rumor. Before major battles, his agents would spread tales of mythical armies descending from the east or plague outbreaks in Muslim camps, sowing confusion in enemy ranks. During negotiations, they'd exploit Crusader rivalries, whispering to Templars that Hospitallers had secret deals with Saladin, and vice versa. Even religion became a tool. Saladin's handlers fabricated visions of crosses cracking in Jerusalem's churches, demoralizing defenders long before his soldiers reached the gates. What set his network apart wasn't just its scale, but its structure. Unlike European lords who relied on mercenary informants, Saladin built loyalty through kinship. Many agents were Kurds from his own tribe, bound by blood oaths, while others were Mamluks raised from childhood in his household. This created a web almost impossible to infiltrate. When the Templars once captured a spy in Tyre, the man bit off his own tongue rather than risk betraying his handlers under torture. The legacy of this shadow war lingers in plain sight. Many Crusader chronicles gripe about Saracen trickery, oblivious to the sophistication behind their defeats. Modern special forces still study Saladin's use of terrain and deception, but the real lesson runs deeper. In an age of clashing swords, he proved that information, wielded with precision, could topple kingdoms without striking a single blow. His greatest victories began not with a battle cry, but with a whisper in the right ear at the perfect moment. The towering walls of Saladin's Cairo citadel don't just dominate the skyline, they tell a story in stone, one where brute force and delicate artistry shake hands. Perched on the Muqattam hills, this fortress wasn't just a military stronghold. It was a chess move carved into limestone. Saladin's engineers designed it with arrow slits angled to rain death on invaders, yes, but also with open courtyards where scholars debated under shaded arches. He wanted a seat of power that could withstand sieges while radiating the sophistication of his reign. Walk its ramparts today and you'll spot the same genius, towers thick enough to shrug off catapults, yet adorned with geometric tiles so precise they'd make a mathematician weep. This was the Sultan's signature buildings that served the sword and the pen in equal measure. Down in the citadel's shadow sprawled another of his masterstrokes, the Nasir Hospital. Medieval Europe still clung to the notion that illness was divine punishment, but Saladin's physicians worked in sunlit wards where running water carried waste away, where patients were grouped by ailment, contagious diseases isolated, mental illnesses treated with music therapy. The hospital's pharmacy stocked herbs from as far as India, its ledgers detailing free care for the poor funded by religious endowments that still operate today. Unlike the grim infirmaries of Crusader castles, this was healing as civic pride, a declaration that a ruler's greatness was measured not just by conquests but by how he cared for the weakest. Then there's the Great Mosque of Aleppo, rebuilt under Saladin's patronage after earthquakes shattered its minaret. His architects didn't just restore it, they reimagined it as a communal hub. The courtyard's fountain became a gathering spot for legal scholars, its library shelves groaning with texts on astronomy and philosophy. Even the mihrab, the niche pointing toward Mecca, was framed by an arch inscribed with verses celebrating knowledge. Every brick whispered a message. Devotion and intellect weren't rivals but partners. But perhaps the most revealing sights are the smaller caravanserais dotting Syria's trade routes. These weren't just fortified inns for merchants, they were engines of economic unity. Saladin's engineers positioned them a day's camel ride apart, their thick walls safeguarding silk and spices while their courtyards hosted negotiations between Arab, Kurdish, and Turkic traders. The real brilliance lay in the details: underground ice houses to preserve food, stables with graded floors for easy cleaning, even secret tunnels for emergency escapes. These weren't just buildings, they were the glue holding his empire together, proving that infrastructure could bind fractured lands tighter than any oath. The irony, many of these structures outlasted his dynasty by centuries. Walk through the souks near Damascus's Umayyad Mosque, and you'll still find shops built on Saladin-era foundations, their arched doorways bearing the same proportions he standardized for easy troop movements. The citadel's aqueducts, designed to survive sieges, now irrigate olive groves. Even his military innovations became civic blessings. Those zigzagging fortress gates meant to slow attackers now charm tourists with their play of light and shadow. The Sultan, who united empires through war, may have left his most enduring legacy in the quiet stones that served lives instead of ending them. The curved blade resting in Damascus's National Museum gleams under spotlights, its steel etched with flowing Arabic calligraphy, an artifact labeled as the Sword of Saladin. But lean closer and cracks appear in the legend. This weapon, like so much of the Sultan's story, straddles the line between history and myth. Medieval chronicles describe Saladin wielding a scimitar so sharp it could slice through a floating silk scarf, yet not a single eyewitness account from his lifetime specifies its design or fate. The truth behind his weapon reveals less about the man himself and more about how succeeding generations reshaped his legacy to fit their own narratives. Start with the steel. Traditional depictions show Saladin with a classic Middle Eastern shamshir, the curved scimitar synonymous with Islamic warriors. But dig into 12th century sources and contradictions emerge. Crusader chronicles, particularly those describing his duel with a Templar knight at Montjesard, mention him using a straight, double-edged sword, likely a European-style arming sword taken as spoils. Arab poets, meanwhile, praised his lightning-curved blade, a possible nod to Turkic killage designs favored by Zengid cavalry, the likeliest scenario. Saladin, ever the pragmatist, wielded whatever weapon suited the moment: straight swords for close-quarters melee, curved blades for horseback strikes. Then there's the matter of the Sword of Mercy. Legend claims Richard the Lionheart gifted Saladin a ceremonial European longsword after their truce, its blunted tip symbolizing respect. No contemporary account confirms this exchange, but the story gained traction in 19th-century Orientalist paintings, where artists draped Saladin in romanticized garb while clasping a Gothic-style sword. The fantasy reveals more about Victorian-era fetishization of the noble savage than historical reality. Modern nationalism further muddied the waters. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, newly independent Arab states scrambled to claim Saladin as their cultural forebear. In 1975, Syria's Assad regime rediscovered a 14th-century Mamluk sword in Aleppo's vaults, rebranding it as Saladin's personal weapon, a propaganda tool to bolster pan-Arab unity. Similar claims emerged in Egypt and Iraq, each authentic blade suspiciously tailored to the politics of its time. The most enduring myth involves the sword's supernatural qualities. Sufi mystics spun tales of its blade being quenched in the waters of the Zamzam well in Mecca, while Ottoman storytellers claimed it glowed before battle. These fictions mirror Arthurian legends of Excalibur, suggesting a universal human longing for leaders wielding divinely ordained power. Perhaps the real lesson lies not in the metal, but the metaphor. Whether curved or straight, real or imagined, Saladin's sword became a canvas for projecting ideals of chivalry, resistance, or piety. The man himself likely cared little for the particulars. His genius lay not in the weapon he carried, but the strategy behind each swing. After all, the sword that reclaimed Jerusalem wasn't forged in a smithy. It was tempered in the minds of those who believed in the hand that held it. The shadow war between Saladin and the assassins wasn't fought on open battlefields, but in the alleys of fear and deception. The Hashashin, that enigmatic Shia sect holed up in their mountain fortresses, weren't just another enemy. They were ghostly blades in the dark, masters of psychological terror who turned murder into theater. Twice they slipped past Saladin's guards, leaving poisoned daggers inches from his heart. The first attempt came in 1175 as he besieged their stronghold of Masyaf. A lone assassin, disguised as a desert trader, nearly reached his tent before a suspicious groom raised the alarm. The second strike was even bolder, a blade-wielding fanatic who somehow infiltrated his camp near Aleppo, only to be spotted at the last moment by a watchful Mamluk. These weren't just assassination attempts, they were calculated messages designed to shatter the aura of invincibility around the rising sultan. What made the assassins so uniquely dangerous wasn't just their skill with daggers, it was their economy of violence. While Saladin needed armies to conquer cities, they needed only one devoted killer to paralyze empires. Their leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, understood power dynamics better than any warlord. By targeting Saladin, he wasn't just eliminating a rival, he was proving that no fortress, no bodyguard, no reputation could shield you from his wrath. The terror worked. For months after the attempts, Saladin slept in a raised wooden enclosure, its latticed walls allowing air but no unseen hands. His cooks tasted every dish, his physicians inspected every vial of medicine. The psychological toll was immense. A conqueror who'd faced down Crusader charges now glancing over his shoulder at every whisper. Yet Saladin's response revealed his strategic genius. He could have wasted precious resources storming the assassins' eagle nest castles, a futile endeavor that had broken stronger armies. Instead, he chose a path few medieval rulers dared: negotiation. Through secret envoys and coded messages, he reached an understanding with Sinan, an unspoken truce where the assassins would halt attempts on his life in exchange for territorial concessions and a mutual focus on fighting the Crusaders. Some chroniclers claim Saladin even paid tribute, though he carefully framed it as protection money for travelers rather than submission. The agreement was fragile, riddled with distrust, but it held. By acknowledging the assassins as players rather than pests, Saladin turned their fanaticism away from himself and toward common enemies. The real stroke of brilliance, though, lay in how he weaponized their reputation. When Crusader lords received threatening notes from the assassins, sometimes accompanied by daggers left chillingly on their pillows, Saladin made sure rumors spread that he'd orchestrated it. He didn't need to confirm or deny. The mere possibility planted seeds of paranoia in enemy ranks. At the siege of Tyre, defenders hesitated to sortie against his forces, fearing assassin blades more than Muslim arrows. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Saladin had turned the sect's terror into an extension of his own influence without ever giving them direct orders. The lingering mystery isn't whether the assassins could have killed him. They clearly had the means, but why they stopped. Some argue Sinan recognized Saladin's value as a unifying force against the Crusaders. Others whisper of a secret meeting between the two men at Masyaf, where the assassin leader, impressed by the Sultan's courage, supposedly gifted him a dagger with the words, "This is the only weapon you'll need from us." The truth may be simpler. Even fanatics calculate costs. With Saladin's empire stretching from Egypt to Syria, eliminating him risked chaos that could drown the assassins too. In the end, their dance of death became a wary tango, two predators circling each other with grudging respect. The Sultan who survived their blades didn't just outfight them, he outthought them, turning history's most feared killers into unwitting pieces on his chessboard. Saladin's legacy as a paragon of religious tolerance rests heavily on one iconic moment, his merciful entry into Jerusalem. But peel back the layers of this carefully crafted image, and a far more complex reality emerges. The man who spared Christian civilians also dismantled Shia Islam's institutions with ruthless efficiency, revealing a ruler who wielded tolerance as deftly as he did his scimitar, strategically, selectively, and never at the expense of power. Consider the paradox of Jerusalem in 1187. Saladin's forbearance toward the city's Christian population wasn't just an act of compassion, it was a masterstroke of political theater. By allowing pilgrims access to holy sites and protecting churches, he undercut European propaganda that painted Muslims as barbarians. Yet this same leader had spent years methodically erasing the Fatimid Caliphate's Shia heritage in Egypt, shuttering mosques and replacing Shia judges with Sunni scholars. The difference: Jerusalem's Christians posed no threat to his vision of a unified Sunni empire, while the Fatimids' very existence challenged his legitimacy. His tolerance, then, wasn't universal, it was situational, extended only to those whose beliefs didn't challenge his rule. The suppression of Shia dissent exposes another uncomfortable truth. Saladin's conquest of Egypt wasn't merely a military campaign, it was a cultural revolution. Fatimid libraries famed for their collections of Ismaili texts were purged or repurposed. The grand mosques of Cairo, once adorned with Shia calligraphy, saw their inscriptions chiseled away. Even the Fatimid Caliph's deathbed conversion to Sunni Islam, a moment historians still debate, reeks of staged political theater. This wasn't just religious policy, it was the systematic rewriting of history to fit a Sunni narrative with Saladin as its architect. Yet the Sultan's relationship with non-Muslims defies easy categorization. His court in Damascus employed Jewish physicians and Christian scribes, their skills valued above theological differences. The famous physician Maimonides, fleeing persecution in Europe, found refuge under Saladin's rule, eventually serving as his family's doctor. Unlike the Crusaders, who often massacred Jewish communities, Saladin permitted Jews to resettle in Jerusalem after nearly a century of exile. These weren't contradictions but calculations, a recognition that talent and loyalty mattered more than dogma in governing a diverse empire. The real litmus test lies in the margins. While Saladin tolerated people of the book, Christians and Jews recognized in Islamic law, heretical sects like the Nizari Ismailis faced relentless pressure. His uneasy truce with the assassins came only after failed attempts to crush them militarily. Even Sunni scholars who criticized his policies found themselves quietly sidelined. The pattern is clear: dissent, not difference, was the true sin in Saladin's empire. Those who accepted his authority could keep their faith. Those who challenged it faced steel and stone. Perhaps the most telling detail survives in tax records. Under Saladin, non-Muslims paid the jizya, a poll tax symbolizing their protected but subordinate status, yet many communities flourished economically. Armenian merchants in Aleppo, Coptic officials in Cairo, and Italian traders in Acre all thrived under his rule precisely because their prosperity served the state. Tolerance in this light becomes a transactional affair. Compliance bought security, even if equality remained out of reach. The challenge for modern observers is resisting the temptation to judge medieval figures by contemporary standards. Saladin wasn't a modern pluralist. He was a product of his time, navigating a world where religion and power were inseparable. What sets him apart isn't perfect tolerance, but his ability to wield mercy and severity as tools of statecraft. His legacy reminds us that history's most enduring leaders are rarely saints or tyrants, but pragmatists who understood when to open gates and when to guard them. Saladin's call for holy war came with a price tag, one his subjects would feel in their empty grain stores and threadbare purses. The so-called Saladin tithe, imposed in 1188, wasn't just another tax. It was a radical demand, 1/10 of all movable property and income, a staggering burden for peasants and merchants alike. Unlike traditional levies that exempted religious endowments and elites, this decree spared no one. Even the Sultan's closest allies winced as collectors fanned out across Egypt and Syria, armed with scales to weigh gold and ledgers to record every sheep, every bolt of silk, every jar of olive oil. The justification was clear. This was jihad financing, a sacred duty to reclaim Jerusalem. But piety couldn't mask the desperation behind the move. Years of constant warfare had drained treasuries, and Saladin's empire, though vast, was held together by fragile alliances. The tithe wasn't just about funding armies. It was a test of loyalty, a way to force his fractious emirs and weary populace to stake their wealth on his vision. The human cost rippled through markets and mud-brick villages. In Damascus, weavers staged silent protests by leaving their looms unattended. Along the Nile Delta, farmers hid harvests in underground pits rather than surrender their meager surplus. Tax collectors, often accompanied by armed guards, became figures of loathing, their arrival sparking riots in Aleppo's narrow alleys. The strain was especially brutal in regions already bled dry by years of conflict. Yemeni chronicles tell of families selling daughters into servitude to pay the levy, while Kurdish tribal leaders, traditionally exempt from such impositions, bristled at what they saw as betrayal by one of their own. Even Saladin's trusted advisor, al-Qadi al-Fadl, privately lamented the hunger in children's eyes as granaries emptied to fill military coffers. What made the tithe backfire wasn't just its weight, but its uneven execution. Corrupt officials skimmed profits, inflating demands in prosperous cities while turning blind eyes to wealthy landowners' evasion. In Egypt, resentment festered as Coptic Christians already paying the jizya tax found themselves doubly burdened, their protests met with harsher penalties. Meanwhile, frontier regions like Mosul dragged their feet, arguing their resources were needed for local defense against Crusader raids, the tithe's greatest irony. Some of the wealth it extracted funded mercenaries to suppress the very rebellions it sparked. In Hama, a full-blown uprising erupted when local leaders refused to comply, forcing Saladin to divert troops from the Crusader front, a costly distraction that revealed the policy's short-sightedness. Yet the tithe's failures also illuminate Saladin's pragmatic side. When resistance grew unsustainable, he adapted. Exemptions were quietly granted to key allies, while villages ravaged by drought saw their quotas reduced. By 1190, the levy had morphed into a patchwork of negotiated rates, its original purity sacrificed for stability. This wasn't weakness, it was the realism of a ruler who understood that even holy wars rely on earthly economics. The tithe's legacy endures in dusty tax records and poetic laments, a reminder that the man who united empires against foreign invaders sometimes struggled to convince his own people that the cost of glory was worth bearing. When Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a roaring crowd in 1956, defending Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, he didn't just invoke modern nationalism, he draped himself in Saladin's ghost. Posters behind him showed the medieval sultan's face merging with his own, a visual prophecy that Arab unity could once again humiliate Western powers. This wasn't just propaganda, it was alchemy, transforming a Kurdish warlord from the 12th century into a pan-Arab icon. Nasser's genius lay in recognizing that Saladin's victories weren't locked in history books. They were raw, emotional fuel for a region still smoldering from colonial rule. By framing the Suez Crisis as a sequel to Hattin, he turned a political gamble into a sacred struggle, with oil pipelines and canal fees standing in for Jerusalem's holy sites. Saddam Hussein took the myth-making further, twisting Saladin's legacy into a weapon of sectarian dominance. Born near Tikrit, the same riverside town where Saladin entered the world, Saddam commissioned murals showing himself receiving the Sultan's sword in a blaze of heavenly light. Never mind that Saladin had fought fellow Muslims to unite the Ummah. Saddam's version was a Sunni avenger, a precursor to his own brutal suppression of Shia dissent. State television aired lavish miniseries where Saladin spoke with Tikriti inflections, a not-so-subtle nod to Saddam's own tribal roots. Even the Iraqi dinar bore Saladin's likeness during the Iran-Iraq War, a silent promise that history's greatest Sunni champion would bless Saddam's battle against Persia's Shia revolutionaries. The irony, Saladin himself had Persian viziers and Kurdish generals, a diversity Saddam's regime systematically erased from the narrative. What makes Saladin so endlessly malleable is the ambiguity of his legacy. Zionists and Palestinian nationalists both claim him. In 1992, Yasser Arafat stood before the UN wearing a keffiyeh deliberately folded to resemble Saladin's turban, casting the PLO's struggle as a continuation of the Sultan's fight for Jerusalem. Years later, Israeli generals would coin the term Saladin Doctrine to describe Arab armies' encirclement tactics, tacitly acknowledging his strategic genius even as they fought his ideological heirs. This duality, villain to some, hero to others, makes him the perfect political cipher. Leaders as disparate as Erdogan, Assad, and ISIS propagandists have all invoked his name, each cherry-picking aspects of his story to justify contradictory agendas. The deeper truth lies in the wounds Saladin's legend band aids over. For a region fractured by colonial borders and foreign interventions, he represents an era when Muslims, not Europeans, held the pen that drew maps. Modern dictators exploit that longing, offering themselves as vessels for a return to dignity, but the fantasy crumbles under scrutiny. Saladin's real strength wasn't conquest, it was his ability to balance ruthlessness with restraint, to unite rivals without erasing their identities. Today's strongmen mimic the sword but forget the olive branch, the compromise that made his victories endure. Perhaps that's why his ghost still haunts the Middle East, not as a blueprint, but as a rebuke, a reminder that true leadership requires more than just appropriating a dead man's glory. For a ruler who reshaped the medieval world, Saladin left remarkably few personal letters behind, a silence that echoes louder than any battle cry. Official chronicles overflow with grand proclamations and battlefield dispatches, but the man behind the legend remains frustratingly opaque. Where are the midnight musings to his sons, the strategic whispers to his generals, the exasperated notes about unruly emirs? This absence isn't just a historical puzzle, it's a gaping hole in our understanding of how power truly operated in the 12th century. Consider the fragments we do have. A handful of letters to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad survive, stiff with formality and dripping with political theater. Others, like his correspondence with Richard the Lionheart, were carefully crafted for public consumption, designed to be copied and circulated as propaganda. But the raw, unfiltered exchanges, the kind that reveal a leader's doubts and schemes, are conspicuously absent. Some scholars argue this isn't an accident. Saladin's rise involved betrayals, shifting alliances, and brutal realpolitik. What if his successors purged compromising documents to preserve his image as the flawless mujahid? The most tantalizing gaps lie in his dealings with former enemies. After the fall of Jerusalem, Saladin granted surprising liberties to Italian merchant republics like Genoa and Pisa, privileges we know about only through European archives. Did he send secret assurances to these trading powers, ensuring their navies wouldn't interfere with his campaigns? A single letter from a Venetian spy mentions intercepted Saracen dispatches written in cipher, hinting at a shadow diplomacy far more sophisticated than medieval chronicles suggest. Then there's the Vatican question. Crusader prisoners reported seeing Saladin's envoys arriving at papal courts, yet no substantial records of these negotiations exist in Vatican vaults. Were they destroyed during the Borgia era when the Church purged archives for political reasons, or do they still languish in some forgotten chest sealed with 800-year-old wax? Even more provocative are rumors from Ottoman archives, whispers of a lost cache seized when Selim the Grim conquered Egypt in 1517. Turkish historians mention scrolls written in Salah ad-Din's own hand, stored in Topkapi Palace, but these alleged treasures have never surfaced. The silence extends to his family. Saladin's nephew Taqi al-Din later rebelled against his successors, yet not a single reprimanding letter survives. Did the Ayyubid dynasty systematically erase evidence of discord to present a unified front? Or were these documents lost when Mongol hordes burned libraries in Baghdad and Aleppo? The irony is delicious. A conqueror who prized knowledge above plunder may have lost his own voice to the same flames he tried to extinguish. Modern technology offers glimmers of hope. Multispectral imaging could recover faded ink from reused parchments, while AI-assisted document analysis might trace his scribe's handwriting across disparate archives. Perhaps some forgotten monastery in Armenia or Sicily still guards a bundle of letters, mislabeled as Saracen gibberish by some long-dead clerk. Until then, the missing correspondence remains history's tantalizing cliffhanger, a reminder that even the loudest lives can be muted by time's selective memory. The stories of Saladin's legendary horse blur the line between history and poetry, a stallion so swift it was said to outrun the desert wind, so loyal it would kneel to let its wounded rider mount. Chroniclers wrote of a magnificent gift from the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos, a steed bred from royal Arabian stock, its coat like polished onyx and its mane woven with silver threads. But peel back the layers of embellishment, and the truth becomes as elusive as the hoof prints this mythical creature left in the sands of time. Was this animal truly the centerpiece of Saladin's stables, or did later storytellers saddle him with a symbol too perfect to resist? The Byzantine connection offers tantalizing clues. Manuel Komnenos, embroiled in his own chess game against Crusader states, had reason to cultivate Saladin's favor. Gifting horses, especially Arabian ones, was a diplomatic language older than treaties. Arab genealogies from the period mention a black stallion named Al-Mulatham, the Veiled One, possibly traded during truce negotiations in the 1170s. Yet Byzantine records are curiously silent on such an extravagant present. What survives instead are accounts of Manuel sending Saladin silks and falcons, prizes impressive enough, but hardly the stuff of legend. The missing piece, a fragmentary letter from Saladin's vizier, Al-Fadl, thanking the emperor for a creature that mirrors the generosity of its giver. Could this be the horse in question, or merely courtly hyperbole? Then there's the breed debate. Arabian horses were already mythologized in Saladin's era, their bloodlines guarded like royal secrets. Kurdish warriors, however, prized a different lineage, the rugged, Jilfan horses bred in the mountains of Diyarbakir, shorter but hardier than their desert cousins. Saladin's nomadic roots suggest he might have favored these tough mounts during his early campaigns, where endurance mattered more than speed. A telling detail surfaces in the chronicle of Ibn al-Athir, who describes the Sultan riding a dappled grey during the siege of Karak, a far cry from the jet-black charger of legend. Perhaps the most revealing twist lies in the name itself. Later Sufi poets transformed Saladin's horse into al-Burak, mirroring the celestial steed said to have carried the Prophet Muhammad to heaven. This wasn't mere flattery, it tied Saladin to divine favor, his earthly victories blessed by heavenly parallels. The animal became less flesh and more metaphor, a symbol of the Sultan's ability to bridge worlds from the battlefield to the spiritual realm. Even the kneeling trope, repeated in countless miniatures, echoes nomadic traditions where a warrior's bond with his mount defined his identity. So did the legendary horse exist. In all likelihood, Saladin rode many steeds across his decades of campaigning, some gifted, some captured, none as singular as romance pretends, but the persistence of the story speaks volumes. Whether a real animal or a poetic construct, this phantom stallion carries the weight of something deeper, the human need to magnify greatness until even the beasts in its service become extraordinary. The truth may be simpler. The most remarkable thing about Saladin's horse wasn't its speed or pedigree, but the man who rode it into the heart of history. 8 centuries after his death, Saladin stands at the crossroads of memory and myth, a conqueror who forged empires with steel and diplomacy, yet whose greatest battles now rage in the realm of symbols. His legacy splits like light through a prism, refracting into countless colors depending on who holds it to the sun. To some, he's the unifier who stitched together fractured Muslim lands under a single banner. To others, the ruthless pragmatist who dismantled rivals with quiet precision. The same hands that gently lifted Jerusalem's fallen Christians also stripped Shia mosques of their heritage, revealing a leader whose mercy was as calculated as his sieges. History's irony lies in how thoroughly Saladin has outgrown his own life. The Kurdish outsider who rose through Zengid ranks now belongs to everyone and no one claimed by Arab nationalists, Kurdish activists, even Western liberals searching for a noble adversary to contrast with modern extremism. His citadels still crown Damascus and Cairo, but his true monuments are the stories we can't stop retelling. The goblet of water offered to a defeated king, the unseen assassins dodged in moonlit tents, the empty treasury that somehow funded an empire. These tales morph with each retelling, polished into parables that serve whatever cause needs his ghost. Yet beneath the legend thrums a tension we've never resolved. Can a man who spent more years warring against Muslim rivals than Crusaders truly be Islam's champion? Was his tolerance toward Jews and Christians enlightened pragmatism, or proof that faith was always secondary to power? Even his famous chivalry carries an edge. Richard the Lionheart's spared life was more valuable as a living testament to Muslim mercy than as another corpse on the pyre of holy war. Which leaves us with the haunting question: if Saladin could step into our world today, surrounded by movies that cast him as a hero, politicians who invoke his name, and children who recite his deeds like scripture, would he recognize himself? Or would he laugh at the contradictions, at the way history smooths rough edges into fables? The man who once scribbled frantic letters about grain shortages and restless emirs might marvel at becoming an immortal symbol, his humanity traded for the weight of legend. So what do you think? Was Saladin the last knight of a bygone age, or the first realist in a world of holy wars and propaganda? A unifier who transcended bloodlines, or a warlord who knew how to dress ambition in piety's robes? The comments are yours. Debate, dissect, and decide, because the truth about legends isn't just what we inherit, it's what we choose to keep alive.